Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Thursday webinar featuring Jason Chatfield and Ed Steckley, cartoonists based in New York, and we'll be getting started in a few minutes. Let's let some people roll into the webinar, and we'll get started in a few minutes here.
Sounds good. Got a pretty good room in here.
And we've got some pretty good numbers coming in, so we'll wait a few more seconds before we get started. Ed and Jason, thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
All right, so it's 12:02. Let's get started. I'd like to thank everybody for joining our webinar today. Today we've got two great cartoonists and good friends of Wacom, Jason Chatfield and Ed Steckley, joining us today. They do a lot of great, funny, creative work. As you can notice, we've entitled our webinar Two Mad Cartoonists. Well, they do contribute to MAD, but they do a lot of other things too. Both of them are pretty high up in the National Cartoonists Society, and they'll be talking a lot about that today. They'll be talking about their work, how they got into cartooning. They'll maybe even do a little bit of a studio tour for you. And of course, during the latter half of the webinar, we'll get into some drawing as well, because I'm sure you want to see Jason and Ed draw. So without any further ado, Jason, take it away. And thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Doug. I appreciate it. Well, I'm going to start by introducing myself and letting you know a little bit about who I am and what I do. My background, I have a funny accent you can probably hear, which is from Australia. I'm from Perth in Western Australia. I started out as a cartoonist in Perth, doing cartoons for newspapers when I was a teenager, and then started doing illustrations and live caricature work and caricature commissions, and then book illustrations, and my way up to becoming a syndicated newspaper comic strip cartoonist. And I've lived in New York for the last 6 years. And I'm the president of the National Cartoonists Society, which is a big organization of cartoonists of all different stripes, from animators to comic strip cartoonists to children's book illustrators, to all sorts of disciplines. I've been using Wacom products. I was trying to figure it out. It's about 18 years, I think. I started using Wacom products in about 2001, 2002. My first Wacom tablet that I was using was a Graphire 2, which I realize now is some pretty primitive technology, but at the time it was the difference between working by hand and working digitally. And myself and my big, I guess, contributor here, Ed Steckley, we both sort of came from learning to draw traditionally by hand and then transitioning to working digitally. This is the comic strip character that I draw over my shoulder here. This is Ginger Meggs. Ginger Meggs is a syndicated strip that's been going since 1921. For those of you good at math, which is not me, that's 99 years. He's nearly 100 years old. I took the strip over in 2007. So that means I've been writing and drawing the strip for 13 years. Ginger Meggs, you can read him on Go Comics if you're online. And if you're in Australia, you can read him in every major metro daily paper and Sunday papers. And Ginger Meggs is kind of like the Australian Dennis the Menace. He's a little, what we call a larrikin in Australia, a little rat bag of a kid, always getting in trouble. And I think he predates Dennis the Menace by about 60 odd years, but but he definitely has the same sort of attitude and character as Dennis. On top of doing the strip, which is 6 dailies and a Sunday every week in color, which I do completely digitally these days on a Wacom Cintiq. I also do cartoons for the New Yorker magazine and Variety and the Weekly Humorist, Airmail, Wired magazine, and Mad magazine. I've done similar to Ed, I've done a lot of work for Mad in various capacities, doing illustrations and cartoons and single gags and some other various pieces. I find a lot of joy coming up with jokes, because my only two things that I really love are drawing and jokes, which is why cartooning came very naturally to me as a career that I wanted to pursue. I will often sort of bounce jokes off other cartoonists, and because cartoonists are sort of wired in a kind of a strange way. We all have a different way of looking at the world. So whenever I have an idea for a joke, I'll sort of play around with it, and then once in a while I'll sort of bounce it off someone else and see, hey, is this something funny? Is this okay? You know, for instance, this is one fresh off hot off the press, I should say, which is a cartoon that my co-host here, Ed Steckley, came up with and slang it over to me while we were both bored and in quarantine.
No response.
Which he threw it over and I drew it up, which was the gentleman on the left watching TV, drinking beer at home. And then quarantine's over, you can go outside. And then obviously arriving at doing what we're all going to do as soon as we're allowed to go back to bars. Those kinds of things are great. I love collaborating with other artists. I consider cartoonists to be, you know, as competitive as the industry itself is, I don't consider cartoonists to be my competition, as it were. They're very much colleagues and kindreds.
Hey, Jason, quick question.
Doug, yes.
For Ginger Megs, how far in advance do you have to write those?
Oh, well, for Ginger Megs, I'm about 8 weeks ahead with the Sunday strips, because those are the ones that need to be laid out weeks in advance. They do them all in big batches, and they have to translate them into different languages. Ginger Megs goes out to about 34 countries, so the syndicate has to translate it into different languages, and the editors have to go through it and make sure that it makes sense, which that's not a job I would want. So yeah, I have to work quite far ahead for those. For the dailies, it's slightly less. It's about 4 to 5 weeks, but I like to be about 6 weeks ahead with the dailies if I can, just in case anything happens, like a pandemic or a riot. I like to have some strips sort of all lined up so that I'm not worried about what's going to go out, you know, this week. And I do now keep them rather topical. The strip actually in the last sort of 8 weeks has been about Ginger Megs being in quarantine and having to be homeschooled via virtual through the laptop. And I am actually interested in sort of keeping him relevant and modern and contemporary, because as the previous artist did, James Kemsley, my predecessor on the strip, he liked to keep it sort of up to date with what people were actually talking about, thinking about, laughing about. And I like to think that I'm sort of keeping that ethos alive in the strip. One other aspect, the last aspect I'll mention about what I do is I often, as an addendum to my comment about wanting to collaborate with other funny people, I do stand-up comedy, have done for about 12 or 13 years, and one of my fellow comedians, an Australian named Scott Dooley, who is here in Australia, in New York, he's also from Australia. He is, we would meet up on a Monday night at the bar and just have some beers and throw some ideas around for jokes, as, you know, what might make a funny joke for stand-up, or, you know, this might be a New Yorker cartoon, or this one's probably more of a Mad magazine idea. And we'd sort of just throw around ideas. I'd bounce gags off him. And so at one point he said, hey, you know, his background is in radio. He said, this would make a pretty fun podcast. And I was like, well, I don't think people really are that interested in listening to a visual medium. People talk about you know, something visual. But I was terribly wrong because when he finally convinced me to do a sort of proof of concept, as it were, and come up with a podcast about coming up with New Yorker cartoons, it really took off. So we have a podcast called Is There Something in This?, where we both talk about the art of coming up with cartoons, most specifically for the New Yorker, but also for Mad Magazine and other publications. It's a very silly podcast, but it sort of combines my love of jokes and drawing into one audio medium. So as I mentioned, I sort of come from a traditional background of drawing by hand. I have a studio here in New York City where I have a full setup of traditional, you know, dip pen and ink with nibs and watercolors and different papers and brushes and things like that. But I also have a Mobile Studio Pro that I use when I work at ad agencies and when I work remotely and when I travel. And I have a big drawing board that I sit and draw at. My process, as we'll expand on in a little bit, is ever evolving. I don't really have a static process for how I do things. I don't really stick to one way of creating art. And I don't really like to settle into a rhythm of just doing things one way. I'm always trying new tools, new technologies, new brushes, new shortcuts, and new little tricks in things like Photoshop and Sketchbook, and online drawing like Aggie, which you'll be introduced to in a little while. I think it's really important for an artist to explore new ways of working. And as I mentioned, you know, you can actually very successfully transition from working by hand if you are a traditional creator and you're used to working by hand. You can transition to working digitally, as myself and Ed have, rather seamlessly. And the kind of work that you can produce can be just as authentic and just as clean and clear and interesting and unique as your stuff that you created traditionally is. Here are some of the
Jason,
illustrations.
We have a quick question. Sorry to interrupt.
Sure.
But somebody was asking about you know, how you promote yourself and what types of social media you use to do that, etc.
Sure, yeah. Well, it's a good question because I have a love-hate relationship with social media. I was always an early adopter of any medium that let me share my art. So I was on Twitter. I got a referral code for Twitter back in 2006 from a friend who was in San Francisco working on a startup called Square. I wish I'd asked him more questions at the time. I remember connecting to a lot of artists on Twitter and asking them what they were doing. And they were saying this new social media thing and Facebook, and at the time, MySpace, I'm dating myself here, that these are good ways to share your art. And then things like Tumblr came along. And then I was always sharing my art on Tumblr, almost a little too much. I was sharing unfinished art and sketches and process work, which I'd be embarrassed to do today. But yeah, I use Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram primarily as the main means of social media. And what I tend to do is, instead of jumping on there every day and spending time, I use a service called buffer.com, buffer.com. And I tee up all the posts about a week in advance. And there's a schedule, and it just posts it when you say it. When you want it to post, I post things like artwork, drawings, process, blog posts about how I'm doing things, projects that I'm working on, technology that I'm discovering, and reviews of Wacom products, all sorts. I've probably just any other way in the last decade, of trying to look people up through book collections and trying to meet them in person. I have a post on my blog right now about the fact that Pinterest has overtaken Tumblr as the way that I now find new and interesting artists who are using fascinating methods, digitally and traditionally, of creating their illustrations and cartoons and artwork. Pinterest seems to be a really vibrant marketplace of ideas as far as how we're adapting to an online environment where people are viewing art on a screen instead of on paper. So it's probably a long answer to a very simple question, but the workflow.
That answered it pretty well. And there's another question about your digital workflow.
Sure,
obviously,
yeah.
you still use traditional media as well, but talk a little bit about your how you go about your digital work.
Sure. Well, on the screen now you can see a drawing that I did with dip pen and ink. It was just a crow quill nib, and then I brought it into Photoshop to kind of clean it up a bit, because one of the luxuries we have now is that as much as I like happy accidents and the asymmetry of artwork created by hand, I do like to fix little mistakes that I've made without having to start again. So very often I will sketch things out by hand on paper, just to kind of get a sense of the size and scale of things. It's a very, it's unique to every single artist, which is why I always find it really interesting to sort of see. That's all I'm ever asking other artists is, hey, how are you doing things? What are you doing? How are you coming up with this kind of thing? How are you doing that? Yeah, so this is no exception. I tend to use Photoshop when I'm working digitally. I use the Wacom Cintiq. I have the 24-inch, and I'm actually using a it's called the Wacom Pro Pen Slim, which I find fantastic. And the reason for that is when I started out drawing sort of cartoons and doing things traditionally, I would use a pencil, and a pencil is quite a thin, it's a thin implement. And when you're drawing, your hand creates muscle memory, and it creates things like just little bits and pieces that make your art and your style unique to you. So when I switched from using the default Wacom Intuos and Wacom Cintiq and Wacom Herbal Studio Pro styluses, which are arguably better for your wrist and your hand, I actually found that my old style came back, and the old style of when I would work traditionally. So I'm just sharing my screen now. For instance, I got asked to do, or I can show you exactly, I got asked to do a wine label, an illustration for a wine label. And within the sort of scope of drawing something here by, in pencil and doing the roughs and sort of getting an idea of how it looks on paper and the scale and making little changes and things, what I would then do is I would scan that in or take a photo with my phone and bring it into a program. Like if I'm working in Vector, I actually use Flash instead of Illustrator. It's just my own process. And if I'm working traditionally, I'll just, without vectors, and I want to work in rasterized files, I'll just use Photoshop. I will use that layer as sort of a transparent layer underneath a layer of inks. And I will trace over, but sort of, I don't want to be too, I kind of want to have fairly loose pencils so that I don't lose the spontaneity of line that you get. And what I'll sometimes do is even put a green screen underneath so that I'm not looking straight directly at the pencils. It kind of actually detracts the eye. So you create this kind of, you can see you have this kind of, it's almost like a transparent pencil so that your inks look a little bit more original and rather less traced. I like using the Pro Pen Slim with the settings on my actual sort of Wacom driver, tablet driver, set so that the tip feel is pretty soft. And that means that I can get some very fine lines and some really nice levels of pressure sensitivity so that once it comes to actually doing inks, I don't really see that much of a difference between working with a nib and working on a screen. One extra detail I should note is that I use the felt tip nib. The felt tip nib is actually, it comes with all the Wacom products. If you crack open your pen holder, you'll actually see a number of different nibs that you can choose from. I use the felt tip nib because it gives me a little bit more drag, a little bit more friction against the screen than the traditional plastic nib. And it gives me the opportunity to get some of those really nice sort of inked lines there. So once, to wrap up that question, once I have the sort of inks in place, what I can then do is block in the solids, just like this, and then add shadows and highlights, which are things like adding, you know, like you can see here, sort of adding little shadows to different parts of the illustration, and drawing the eye towards the things that you really want to be paid attention to. So you can sort of see here that I get to sort of exaggerate certain parts of clothing and parts of the illustration. So that's sort of, that's been my process for a long time. But as I mentioned, I do mix it up quite a bit. I like to change things. I like to not get too comfortable in one way of doing things. And I think, and again, I encourage that. So a job like this, which is what the finished product looks like, is kind of a unique piece of art that won't be replicated the same way if I do something similar. For instance, I'll draw something like this digitally, and then maybe I'll take it onto the drawing board and lightbox it and do it a little bit differently. I hope everyone knows what I mean when I say lightboxing. Yeah, so I create all kinds of digital art, and I create traditional art that that makes me laugh. I just like to draw things that make me laugh, and then hope that there's enough people out there that have the same sick sense of humor as I do, to create sort of some goodwill and a bit of levity in what is otherwise a pretty dark period.
That's great. And before we kick it off to Ed Steckley, can you let us know how do you get your inspiration and ideas? I mean, where do those come from?
Thank you to Catherine, by the way, who liked the Trump one. I want to, so this is a question that, as you know, Doug, cartoonists get asked quite a lot. I once tried answering it in a blog post, but the problem is that a blog post doesn't really cover the elusive process of what coming up with ideas and finding inspiration is. I touched on it earlier, but one of my favorite things is to have an idea or a seedling of an idea that is derived from something I've seen in the real world, and then try and expand upon that idea through conversation and collaboration, talking to other cartoonists and artists, and looking at other people's work and going, oh, they approached it that way. Oh, that's interesting. I'll go the opposite direction, see what happens there. When I'm preparing things like a batch of New Yorker cartoons every week, I will very often, the ideas stage, which is what you're asking about, is probably the most difficult part. I very often, it's going to sound silly to you all, but I sit in the bath on Sunday. I call it Scotch Bath Sunday. I bring a scotch in with me, why not? And I get a lot of good ideas in the shower and in the bath. Like a lot of people, you come up with interesting ideas when you're in the shower or when you're brushing your teeth, when you're doing something that, you know, doesn't require a lot of thought. You know, the automated processes are underway, so the subconscious can really play. So I have these, as you can see on the screen, these aqua notes, which are sort of, I guess they're waterproof pads with a pencil attached. And if I have ideas that come up to me in the shower, I quickly scribble them down. I have a very patient wife because I have a very messy shower walls. And I develop those ideas, as I mentioned, with my friend Scott sometimes, or with other cartoonists, or I'll just marinate on them and draw them out. And I'll write them out, I'll figure out, get them on paper, get them out of my brain and see what they look like, do sketches. But they are arrived at, back to the question, they're arrived at through just absorbing the world and listening. Sort of not walking out of my front door with earbuds in, you know, just sort of actually going and listening to conversations people are having, or overhearing, you know, someone's car radio, or they come from the strangest places, or a snippet of conversation of someone who, you know, was talking to a friend on the phone, and you get an out of context statement. You wouldn't believe the amount of funny ideas that I've got from just accidentally eavesdropping on a phone conversation. So yeah, it's a complicated question because it's different for everyone. For myself, I find inspiration everywhere. And I think you have to be open to it. You have to be attuned to looking for certain, you have to be attuned to looking for things. Yeah, it's almost like if you're looking for them, they'll present themselves, but you've got to be looking for them. Otherwise you won't notice them. That's I feel like that's something I've been told and absorbed. I couldn't attribute it to anyone, but it's good advice. But yeah, there's a lot of artists who actually on the Wacom, there's a link here on the Wacom community. There's a lot of artists who I listen to and read and watch who actually have some really interesting insights on this stuff, where I would never have thought to look for inspiration in certain things, and then have sort of taken their advice and then gone, wow, that's amazing. And for instance, I mentioned earlier collaborating with cartoonists, and I go down to the New Yorker, well, I used to before quarantine, every Tuesday morning. All the cartoonists go to the New Yorker, we wait in the cartoon lounge, we all talk shop, we talk cartoons, and if you're stuck on an idea, you might want to run it off, you know, bounce it off someone. For instance, you can see here we've got Sam Gross, Bob Eckstein, you know, we've got George Booth here, Mort Gerberg. These are fantastic analytical comedic minds who, if you're having trouble with a gag and how to make it fly, how to make it funny, how to make it really sing, bounce it off one of these guys, and boy, you get a whole new perspective. There was I was sitting with, this is a very story that's in an answer to the question. I was sitting with Mort Gerberg here, and we were having lunch in the cafeteria at the New Yorker one day, and he was talking about doctors, about GPs, and doctors tend to have terrible handwriting, and it's one sort of professional, it's one of those jobs that you really ought to have good handwriting, because if someone misreads a prescription or something or a referral, you're in big trouble. But we were talking about it, and we thought what would be really funny is if there was, I said to him, listen, what if three things? The first one was a doctor on a desert island trying to make a help sign out of some rocks, but it was so messy that the plane flying over doesn't understand the help because his handwriting's so bad. And then I said, he said, that's funny, there's probably something there. And then, and I got it from him talking about doctors and handwriting. I said, what if they were at a protest? And go with me on this. I know it's a delicate time to bring this up, but I sort of brought up the idea of protests being this sort of thing where people walk around with placards. They walk around with big signboards and things on them, and they're protesting something. And so here's what I said, what if they were doctors and the things on their placards were illegible, so no one knew what they were protesting about? It's a funny note, Giovanni saying, I won't trust a doctor with a fine handwriting. That's very funny. So Mort said, what if you put a title at the top saying, doctors protesting against the general assumption that they have atrocious handwriting? And I think that's what really sold the joke, was his insight to have the title up the top there and then have the gag underneath with all the doctors marching in a circle. That's a classic example of where an idea comes from and its genesis, and then the process of turning that into a cartoon. I've probably spoken enough about this so far, and I'll definitely come back to it again, but there is a second panelist on this,
Yes,
and
yes.
he has plenty to say. So I'm very happy to defer to the wonderful Ed Steckley for further interrogation.
Am I on? Oh, that was wonderfully timed.
Hey Ed, by the way, you've already gotten a ton of questions about your book on Rube Goldberg.
A Rube Goldberg book?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have actually, I kind of anticipated that because I'm in the thick of it, and that's all I've been working on for the last couple months now. But I'll get started a little bit here. Hi, everybody. My name is Ed Steckley. I live in New York City, just over the river in Queens. And I guess if Jason's a cartoonist, I don't think I would call myself so much a cartoonist because I'm not much of a writer. What I do is I draw scripts that are more or less given to me, except for the children's books I work on, and I'll explain that in a minute. Hey, Yusuf, Queens represent. I feel so hip when I say that. I work primarily for advertising agencies. I work for Mad Magazine up until fairly recently, I guess. And like I said, children's books with Abrams Publishing. But rather than hear me drone on and on, I'm going to talk a little bit later on about process, how all this stuff is done, how I use Wacom products. But before that, I'll just kind of show a little bit of what I do here. I'm going to go to my share screen and share it. I hope everybody can hear me. Doug, is this working okay?
Yep, it's working fine.
Yeah, this is a collage of a lot of Mad stuff I've done. I got my first job for Mad back in, I think it was 2006. And I hold the dubious distinction of being the contributor with the longest wait in between Mad jobs. I didn't get my next job for Mad until, I forget if it was 2016 or 2017. What can you do? So the stuff I really love to do is Mad. And like I said, I do a lot of advertising because it pays well. And if you're an illustrator, you want to do jobs that make money. But Mad is what I've always been really interested in, and also children's books. And I'm lucky enough now to be able to do both. So here's an example of some Mad stuff. Like I said, this is a collage, and I'm gonna just kind of cycle through here. Drawing Alfred E. Newman. This is not actually for Mad. This is for an event I was participating in. But it's a big honor to get to have the Mad people have you draw Alfred, because he's incredibly hard to draw. They're really particular about how you draw Alfred. No one's ever allowed to do their own real take on him. You have to basically use the original Norman Mingo painting from, I forget what year, but people in the chat will remind me, and go off that. You don't do a caricature of Alfred. You don't put your spin on Alfred unless you're someone like Sergio Aragonés or Mort Drucker. I'm neither of those two. So when I draw Alfred, I have to basically go exactly from the original reference, which is what this is. Some other things I've done for Mad. This is the kind of stuff I do. This is all laid out and designed on a Wacom tablet. I have a big Wacom Cintiq Pro 24. All the sketches are done on that, and everything, all the designing is done, and then everything is transferred to a heavy-duty piece of paper where I do the actual inking. So all of these are laid out and basically penciled on a Wacom, and I submit those for approval. They make their changes, and I go on from there. This is just this is the issue that came out, not the current issue, the previous issue. And these are all spots that had a lot of text around them. But I really like these. They're just kind of fun. This is a 2-pager I did for the top 20 dumbest things of 2019. It seems kind of silly to be talking about how weird 2019 was, but that was December. This is the chairman of Boeing when they had all that Boeing Max trouble. Like I said, the other thing I do is I do kids books. I'm the illustrator for a relatively new series of Rube Goldberg books. If you don't know who Rube Goldberg is, the Rube Goldberg machine is a very simple, a very complicated and delightful waste of time. It's a very complex way to perform a simple task, and this little guy in orange is the new Rube Goldberg. This is him here. And he's a lot of fun, and I'm in the middle of book 2 right now, and there's going to be a few more after that. So this is all done traditionally, but again, designed on the Wacom, and I'll walk through that process in a bit. Little plug for the book, and the second one comes out in spring 2021. This is some of the mad process stuff, but I think I want to know, Jason, do you want to go and talk about your process so we can kind of tag team it?
Yeah, sure, because there's probably some crossovers. I would encourage Ed to mute his microphone now because I'm about to give him a compliment.
Oh.
I think Ed is one of the more, he's very modest, but he's one of the more talented illustrators. Whenever I'm having trouble with a composition or a process, he's the first person I'll bounce something off. Because not only does he have the traditional knowledge of how to create something by hand, but he also has a lot of digital experience working with ad agencies and working on different softwares, and not just doing it from a studio there. He does it remotely on, I think, Ed, do you have a Mobile Studio Pro as well that you use remotely? Or?
Yep, I have the Mobile Studio Pro that when I draw remotely at ad agencies.
Yeah.
I'm only going to let you compliment me for another 45 minutes. Then we have to move on.
No. That's the beginning of the end of the compliments. But the reason I mention it is that I've actually learned a lot and gleaned a lot from Ed's process and incorporated it into mine through just going into his studio and seeing how he does things. I wonder if it might be more instructive if I start video instead of screen share. Can everyone sort of see my screen there? Can you see that there, Doug?
I can, and I think everybody else can. Yeah.
All right. So this.
Uh-oh.
I'll be honest. It's not completely orderly and minimalist, but I have a lot of art in front of me, in front of my drawing board here, that sort of helps remind me the sort of lessons that I've been learning and trying to improve upon. So my process is very much informed by a lot of other artists that have sort of come before me and who are still working, people who I admire, as well as people who I'm just sort of still trying to figure out how the hell they do what they do, the sort of Richard Thompsons of the world, and Sergio Aragones we have here, and we have Bob Camp, and there's Richard Thompson. My process begins, if you really have to ask, there's a Stedman, there's a Barry Blitt, there's a Joe Cardella, there's a Rich Sparks, Michael Jancy, obviously Al Hirschfeld is a huge influence. I like to kind of absorb a lot of different influences and people who inspire me before I start any sort of work, because I think if you surround yourself with good artwork, you can sort of glean different things from it. You can sort of absorb different little lessons through seeing instead of reading about it or hearing them talk about it. And I do recommend, if there's any young artists sort of coming up, to kind of collect even a scrapbook of artwork that you really like. My process, I mentioned earlier that I use both traditional and digital. I have an old writer's desk here. This was here when I moved into this apartment. We're in Manhattan. This is an old 4th floor walk-up building. The previous tenant, who was a poet, his name's John Farris. This is his writing desk. This is his roll top. And this is where I do a lot of my sketches, a lot of preliminary work, a lot of experimenting. I do a lot of stuff in watercolor and ink, and I use dip pens and brushes and all sorts of different tools here. And this sort of stuff is really fun for when you're you're figuring out a new way to create artwork that that you might not ordinarily have done. There's a lot of works in progress here. I have this is what I think of 2020 so far, which is the 2020 baby, trying to deal with what we've so far had to deal with. And then some other artwork that, as a perfect example of the process, this is drawn by hand. I did a rough of it, and then I took that onto some tracing paper to refine, and then I took it onto a light box, and then, as you can sort of see, that there's ink and wash on this. And then what I would do is I would scan that in using a scanner, a printer scanner over here by my drawing board. And I would bring that onto the Cintiq. Now, this is a drawing board. It's a traditional drawing board.
Jason,
yes.
Nick Galifianakis is asking if you have any of his work on
the
your
great
board.
Nick Galifianakis, yeah. What was his question?
He's asking if you have any of his work on your board.
Of course not. I only post work of artists I admire. So this is a. I would encourage anyone watching to look up Nick Galifianakis' work. He's fantastic. He works for the Washington Post, among others. He's a very, very talented artist. This is a traditional drawing board, and I've actually got my Cintiq on here because I find that I really like to just sit down as if I'm working at the drawing board, but work digitally, and that plugs into a MacBook Pro. And once I have work that I've sort of been sketching on, and I've been you know, trying to figure out the process and figure out what things are going to look like, and figure out, you know, is it going to be digital color? Is it going to be traditional color? Is it going to be traditional? Is it going to be digital? All those decisions are made throughout the whole process. So I'm going to share my screen again now. Sorry for the inelegant switch between screen sharing here. And what I like to do is sort of take things. So for instance, this is Photoshop. I'll take things like a drawing, a caricature, say, and I will take the sketches and the reference images, and I will work through them to a point where I think it looks like it's ready to go to the next stage. So my pencils are underneath, and then my inks are over the top, as well as my sort of colors. And then once I've got color, I can sort of start to really play around with, as I mentioned earlier, with the King illustration, with the wine label. I can change some settings like flow and opacity and things like that, and use different brushes and create different tones and shadows, and pick where the light source is going to be. And we'll probably get into this in a little bit when we get into some more practical things. But as far as process goes, that's kind of from the very beginning of it, from inspiration all the way through to the practical aspects of the finished product. And then eventually I come out with a high-res file that I can either send to the client, or I can send to a sort of print shop or a newspaper or a magazine, and they end up printing from that file. That's another aspect that maybe we can get into. But my background, after I worked in newspapers, was working in print, and I had to learn about CMYK separations and printing presses and design and pre-press and all that sort of stuff, which is an invaluable skill to know as a digital illustrator and a digital designer or cartoonist or artist of any kind. It's really important to know what the next stages of your art are going to look like, so that you can control how they're going to look when they go to print. So I don't know if you can see here in this image. I mean, I'm sort of manipulating what the light and the shadow is going to look like, but I know exactly how that's going to come out in print, because I've memorized what the different CMYK values, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black values are of those colors as I'm sort of shading. So yeah, that's sort of part of my process, as it were. Ed, is there a Venn diagram where we cross over on this sort of thing?
Oh, I'm sorry, my background? That never gets old. Yeah, I think there is a lot of crossover. Yeah, it's you know, using the Wacom to for preliminary drawings and for final. I do a little bit different, but you know, everything pretty much lines up. Is there an answer to that?
Well, I mean, you actually behind you have a giant sketchbook on a drawing board.
Yeah, you know what?
You sort of spin around on your barber's chair and sketch by hand.
I'll talk a little bit about what's around me first. The typical studio. I did a studio tour. It's on my YouTube because I'm fancy, where I walked through everything and showed all the tools and all that. But the camera that I'm using right now is stationary. It's on my iMac, which is what I draw on, and so I can't really move it. But where I'm at here has pretty much everything I need to do any kind of work I want to do. And first thing I do every morning is I grab a pencil, and I have all my tools are right here, just out of view, and I can just and yes, I do sit in a barber chair, and I turn around, and I can do any sketches I want. I always have a big tablet of paper here, and generally in the morning I come over here and I warm up. I try to get down here as early as I can, warm up, kind of get the bugs out, and then if I'm going over to either do some inking or some painting, I generally do it here. There's a big light board on my table here to make me look spooky, and behind me is reference material. Here's a job I'm working on. I always have a big dry erase board behind me here that has things I need to do on it, kind of a to-do list. Right now, it's all the spreads and pages in the book I'm on. So I have little X's and things crossed out that are done, things that need to be done, and all that, so I can stay, so I don't miss anything. I have a lot of things around me that I just like. You know, I have drawing here by a good pal of mine, Sam Vivillon, that is on loan. I love to tell people. But all my tools and everything around here, everything around me is everything I need, all the way down to ink water, pencils, brushes, inks, all that stuff. And on the desk here is the big Cintiq Pro 24 on the flex arm, which I can just, if I'm not using it, I can just push it away. So if I'm not drawing on the Wacom, then I have images up there that I'm using for reference. But what I go through right now is a little bit about the process, about creating a job, both for MAD and for the kids' books. I was reading the comments. There's a lot of people who are actually more interested in the children's books. They've already got everything queued up, so I'm going to go through this anyway.
You have a small furry assistant to the right of your hand at the moment.
Yes.
Who's that?
This is my assistant, Franklin. Franklin will be sneezing at us periodically. If he sneezes at you, that means he likes you, and he's not very good at social distancing. So there's that. So I'm going to share my screen here and show kind of the origins of a Mad Magazine job. So as I awkwardly look for the share button. So for a MAD job here, this is the kind of thing I'll get. I'll get a script and a basic layout of what this article is. This is in the MAD that just came out. What day is it? Came out 2 days ago. So all of you people that subscribe to MAD, go look in your mailboxes or steal your neighbors. And this one is in there. It's in the Al Jaffe tribute issue, which I should actually show. I'm going to hold it up to the camera. This is the one right here. Al Jaffe is a good pal of ours. He's 99 years old. He's a Mad Magazine legend, and Mad had the good sense to dedicate an issue to him to basically celebrate his retirement. So with this issue, and I'll go back to screen sharing. With this issue, they've taken a bunch of scripts of Al's. Is this, did I do this right? Can you guys see my screen here?
I can see your Zoom.
Yeah, we can see your Zoom.
All right. Really good at this.
That's illegal in some states.
Okay, let me try this again, screen share. Okay, there we go. So when I get a job from MAD, this is basically what they give me. They give me this and a script. This is the layout. And tell me if you can see this right.
We can see this right now. Yes.
Okay. This was an article based on an old gag that Al Jaffe did years ago, trademark graffiti. And what they give me is a rundown of what each frame is going to have, and then I just have to sit and draw it. So I sit down at the Cintiq, and what I come up with is basically sketches that look like this. I call these pencils. These are all drawn on the Wacom Cintiq Pro, and these are what I call pencils, even though they're not technically pencils. They're just, I like to sketch in a blue line. I don't know why. I just, for some reason, I just like it. So everything here is basically really roughed out placement, how I think it should look. So I'm going to have two people over here throwing up at the side of this dumpster, and a chef guy over here brings stuff to the dumpster. And it's basically 4 or 6 vignettes. And the gag is there's going to be a trademark logo somewhere in the scene, and someone will have graffitied over that logo. Pretty clever. So you wonder why your pants don't fit. A big dude bounding along, eating a big sandwich. And the good thing about MAD is that they generally kind of let me run with it. I really like that a lot. Like I said, I come from the world of advertising, and I'm really used to being told exactly what they need. We need you to draw this. We need you to draw this scene. 2 people walking in the park with a lake behind them. And you don't really deviate from that. The thing about MAD and other clients I like to work for is that they say, we trust you. We know what you can do. We know what you do. Go with it. And MAD's been very good about that. So this is just a bunch of pencils. These are submitted to the art director, and then she makes her changes and this and that. And then once that's approved, and I learn how to use a computer, then I work out what are basically tighter pencils, which is what these are. So these are, oops, yeah.
Hey Ed, while you're thinking there, what brushes do you use for pencils in Photoshop?
Love this. I use the basic, bare bones Photoshop brushes. I have all of the Kyle's brushes and all kinds of fancy, different Photoshop brushes, but for some reason I always go back to the regular Photoshop round brush. If I need to do a background that needs to look watercolory or something, then I will kind of experiment with the brushes. But
can I ask you a watercolor question?
Yeah.
You are using watercolors and washes and traditional tools for your children's book currently. And I do, a second question is, how did you come to actually decide to do originals instead of doing it all digitally for the book? And second of all, when you do digital watercolors, do you find that having more control changes the style that you arrive at rather than the relative chaos of working traditionally?
Well, I certainly don't think about it. When I did the book, the first book, which came out in 2017, my editor basically demanded that I do everything traditionally. The reason for that is the look. I don't know. I think you can do anything on a computer. You can make anything on a computer look like it's hand drawn. That's where we're at. You can't, if you're good at these tools and you're good at Photoshop, the days of being able to spot digital work are over. So I could have done everything on the computer, and probably they wouldn't even have known. But I just also wanted to become good at painting. Why not? I like to do things the old-fashioned way. So, and now I have all the originals of these things. But if I had to design a book or MAD or anything, if I had to design that, I would go through a lot of paper. So this just saves a whole lot of time. So let's see, when I get to this MAD job, I'm gonna close this, I get the tight pencils here. And then I sit, and I'm gonna stop share and go to the next phase, which is see, I do a bunch of inks. So everything that was on the screen here, I do a wide format printout, and then I put them on the back of a piece of heavy duty board here, throw that on my light table, and I grab and I just start inking. And I have all my inks here.
Do you ever use your Cintiq as a light table?
I've never done that. I'm too afraid. I'm afraid I'll too much can go wrong. Let's put it that way. Although it does seem like it would save a step if you could just put a piece of paper over your machine and trace. I'm too much of a klutz to do that. So I come up with this, and this is the one I just showed you. There's Chatfield in the corner there. Wait, there he is.
Wait a second.
Oh, you
I'm
know,
in Mad Magazine?
do that if he's turned his camera on. And then I bring that. Now I'm going to share screen again. I'm going to bring that into, scan it in, the Photoshop, do all my color there, and I have all that stuff here, which is just.
Can I ask you a quick question before you show that?
You.
Do you, when you ink digitally, do you have more of an inclination to hit the undo key than if you just do it traditionally and get it done one and done?
This is a fantastic question. When I go back and forth from drawing digitally to drawing traditionally, that knee-jerk reaction of hitting the Control Z is something I have to fight through. That's one reason I do like to draw some traditionally as well, because you have to learn how to deal with your mistakes. For this book I'm on, I have a couple false starts. You get an ink smear, you get a boo-boo, something doesn't go right, you got to start over. Because if you're inking and you have to watercolor over that, I haven't found a way to cover up a smudge or a boo-boo with paint. So you get a lot more precise, and me, I get a lot tighter. Yeah, and I use
Digitally or traditionally?
Traditionally. Digitally, I try to use the Control Z key as little as possible. I don't want to get too attached to it. One thing I know about young artists is that they're so used to that undo key that things can get carried away. You have to learn how to deal with your mistakes, how to be better about putting lines down. That's my opinion. I'm also old, so maybe it's yeah. So here's the see, these are the inks of this mad job I did, and what I do, I scan these in. On this one, I know that I had one blob of ink, which goes against everything I just said. You know, I didn't white it out. There was a little drop, and I went into this scan, and I just colored over it. It was easy. That's one of the benefits of working digitally, because again, this was on a deadline, so I didn't have a whole lot of time to sit and monkey around with it. I had to get it done. I had about a day. I think I had 2 days to draw it, maybe a day and a half to color it, and I had to get it out. So once it's scanned in, then I just start coloring. And if you can see my my layers palette here, I have all of my different layers all ready to go here. So I have background colors. I do all those, and then I zoom into each one. So I zoom in, and then I just color in as I need it. I do all the backgrounds. When that's done, then I'll color in, I'll block in the foregrounds here.
Is that very time consuming for you? Do you find that quicker doing it digitally or quicker doing it by hand?
I think it's much quicker doing it digitally. You save a lot of time.
Agreed, yeah.
If you have to do it the old-fashioned way, you have to wait for paint to dry.
Yeah, right.
A lot of factors like that. So if it's a job,
Right.
I will, I really, I think I'm the last generation to actually not have computer drawing it as an option. When I was just starting out, I had to draw and paint the old-fashioned way. They didn't. I think Wacom was around, but I certainly couldn't afford a tablet, and they weren't Cintiqs. My first Wacom was it was a hand-me-down. A buddy of mine upgraded, and I had a big, what you would call an Intuos tablet now, but it wasn't called that, but it was that big and it was about that deep, and it was great.
Is it called a Graphier?
I just don't remember. It was 20 years ago, but I loved it. And I remember I got a magazine job. I got some small magazine. I think it was Kentucky Monthly Magazine. When you go to the dentist, I did a cover, and it was the Isley Brothers was the cover. I guess they're from Louisville or something like that. And so I had to do a caricature portrait of these two figures. And I was having a lot of fun with it. I'm not sure if I drew it the old-fashioned way or if I drew it all digital, but I remember zooming in so close that I was drawing individual braids on the guitar, of the guitar strings. And each one, zip, 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 had a highlight and it had a shadow. And just kind of got lost in it. And then when it came out in print, all you see are these black lines for these guitar strings. So that was a lesson learned. So that now I know to never really, if I'm drawing and painting, I don't go, I tend to leave it right about here, right? Maybe 50%, maybe 100% up, but that's it.
Right.
You see it and you start canoodling stuff in here. And this is a little bit low res because this is just a saved file. If I wanted to sit and work on Sam's nose here, I can get as detailed as I wanted to. That's the good thing about traditional. However, that stuff's not going to show up in print. This guy is actually in the chat, so sorry about that,
Sam Viviano, yes. The ex-art director of Mad Magazine for many years.
Here to,
I want to ask you about that because Tom Richmond, who is also a great proponent of using digital, using a Wacom Cintiq for coloring Mad Magazine spreads and artwork and caricature. He would often talk about when he started out digitally, zooming in on one tiny little area and overworking all the little details and then zooming out and realizing that once it went to print, no one was going to see it.
Yeah, I think everybody who transfers from working traditional to digital goes through it. Everyone has to learn that, oh, there is, I don't have to get that detailed. Didn't take long for me to figure that out. It took one job. And then going forward, I knew, oh, I don't have to work quite that hard on this because that cover that I was just talking about took me days and days to do these things. So that was kind of nice, If I realized that I did have to zoom in to the minuscule level and do highlights and shadows on every guitar string, each job I had money, And I guess I'm not really in this for the money. I'm in it for the art.
I don't think anyone's in it for the money. There was one thing that I wanted to ask you because I think it's an interesting conversation you and I often have, and it's something I struggle with as an artist, and something that I think a lot of cartoonists kind of talk about. And it's something that Nick Meglin, the late Nick Meglin, used to talk about, which is where he would say that overwork can strangle art rather than breathe life into it. Understatement can be more effective than overstatement sometimes. There's always this delicate balance between telling too much of the story and telling just enough to get people's minds just over the line so they get what you're trying to do. How do you grapple with that? What do you redo artwork if you think it's overworked?
That's a really good question. I do overthink the work. The older I get, the better I get at knowing when to bring it in and when to say, okay, I try to think of the overall audience. I don't think of like one person looking at something. I think of what's the collective going to think of this? My drawings are there to entertain. And if there's a joke involved, does that joke come across? Is it obvious? Or if I want it to be a hard to find Easter egg, is it concealed enough? One thing that I had to deal with early on, I used to draw for Cracked magazine. Yeah, not to brag, but
Boo.
Cracked was notorious for taking my gag. And half of that was I was artist writer. The other half I would do parodies and stuff. But if I did an artist writer thing, I tried to do as much pantomime as possible because I'm a big fan of Sergio Aragonés.
Right.
And I went through a Sergio phase when I thought, oh, I'd like to do this. And then I realized no one's going to be as good as Sergio, so I stopped. But I would have a page of gags, and the editorial group would look at it, and they would add elements to the pages that would make it more obvious. Like they would add word balloons. Or
right.
King Kong is looking up at the sky. Look at, when it's just a picture of King Kong looking up at, it would dumb it down. And oh man, it irked me. But it was one of my first published, it was an early published gig. And I also learned a long time ago that I work for the client. That's how I do my work as an illustrator. I'm not doing this for myself. Well, I like to draw, obviously, but this is a job. It's a job that I like to do. I'm happy to have, but I work for the client. The client doesn't work for me. So if they come to me and they say,
that's why you're still employed.
The client comes to me and they say, you have X, Y, but we also need Z in here. I take a page from the Jack Davis Al Jaffe book where you just go, okay, great. You don't get mad about it. That's my mindset. I don't see any of this as, I don't really know how to word it, but some people, artists love, I'm an artist, and if you don't understand it, I don't want to deal with you. I'm not that guy. I also work a lot. So I think there's a correlation there. If I want to do artwork for myself, I do it, and I don't show anybody. But if I'm doing a job and they want to make changes on it, you better believe it. You have to do it with a smile. With that said, some of the decisions Crack made were a little stupid, I thought. I don't think anybody from that group is here, so that's good. But my old work, there was also no art direction over there either, and I work best with an art director. I'm again, coming out of the world of advertising, you have to work with a team, you collaborate, and you draw what they need. You put your
You can't be a diva.
Not be a diva. That's one of the biggest problems I think that young artists have. So, well, this is my style. This is what I do. If you want to make it as a commercial illustrator, that doesn't fly. Also, another note about being an artist, because this is stuff I like to talk about, is that one thing I've always been good at is not limiting myself to one medium, style, outlet. If you'd have told me 10 years ago that I'd be doing children's books, I would have gone, what? That doesn't fit. But when I go, you could grab it. In my early days, and I think every artist in the room can appreciate this, I took every job that came in. I got jobs drawing tractors. I got jobs designing restaurant signs in Milwaukee. I took everything, and I was always happy to have it. I'm from the mindset where it's like, as long as you're working, it's all good. Only in the last number of years have I been able to say, you know what, I don't want to do that. That's not really me. And I feel terrible every time I do, because we should be grateful for the work. But I'm old. I just do what I wanted.
Well, that's an interesting thing, because the luxury of being able to turn down work if it's not what you do. What would you say to young artists who are trying to crack into the industry, who are trying to figure out how to get work right now?
I would say to young artists trying to get into the industry, you should go into acting. It's a lot. You have a lot of. That's a serious question. Of course, we get a lot. My basic answer to that is get good, especially if you're in college. I'm a strong believer in this. I'm on the Dean's Advisory Board of my alma mater in Wisconsin for this very reason. If you're an art student, you should have to take classes that aren't involving art. You should have to take accounting, marketing. You should have to do all that stuff. I think it's ridiculous.
That's very good advice.
Art majors graduate without knowledge of how to build a portfolio, how to talk to people, how to network. how to advertise, how to do an invoice. If I had had those classes, my 20s and early 30s would have been a lot smoother, but I didn't. So that's getting into the business. I mean, if you do the work, if you constantly produce work, and it's a great time to be an artist now because we've got things like Instagram and Facebook where you don't have to mail out postcards anymore. You can just put things online with the right hashtags and the right eyeballs will see what you're doing.
Can you just expand on that? There are people who have no idea that we used to have to send out postcards before the internet.
Yeah, back in the old days, in the 90s, we used to have to advertise in the illustrators' annual books, a couple $1,000s to put one page in a book of 2,000 other artists that gets sent to every art director in the country, and they flip through it and they see your phone number and they call you. You have to do postcards. You would do an image and have to buy a list of addresses of magazines or record companies or whoever you work for and physically mail them out. And you get the rejection letters in the mail. I still have all mine.
You do?
Yeah, I have a file cabinet full of my rejection letters from Time, Entertainment Weekly, Playboy, everybody. That's just the way it was. If somebody bit, they would call you, leave a message on your answer machine, and the next day you'd call them back. All that's different now. So I think it's a fantastic time to be a young artist looking to get into the business because all the parts about getting your work in front of the right eyeballs, that's not really a factor anymore. If people are looking for work, if people are looking for artists, they just go to Instagram, they just go to this, they just go to Facebook, or there's probably new ones now that I don't even know of. That it's also, all those platforms are saturated, so your work still has to be the best. If you have two people that draw kind of okay, and you have one person really, really good, that person whose work stands out is going to get the work.
Hey Ed, we have a question here.
The answer is no.
The answer is no. Okay. All right. Somebody's asking if you got much business off the Directory of Illustration annuals.
I'm afraid to answer that because if it's someone. I was in the Illustrators annuals, the Directory of Illustrators annual for 2 years, and I never got a single job.
Aha.
And,
that's money well spent.
Yeah. Yeah, to be fair, that's also before I kind of practiced what I preached, where I was trying to shoehorn what I thought I was good at. And if you look at those pages, you look at it and go, that doesn't look like anything Ed did. I was just starting in advertising, so I did stuff, I did marker comps, and I did, but I tried to weave some caricatures in there, which is my first love. And Jason and I both know well now that caricatures and advertising don't really mix. So
how would you suggest getting a children's book agent? That's another question that came out.
Well, first you have to sell your soul.
That's a good question.
Sell your soul to the devil, and then after getting a children's book agent, agents they're business people just like we are business people. If you have a project that you want to get done, look up all the literary agents, find one that does work similar to like in the same vein as what you're doing. Don't go to Stephen King's agent looking for a children's book deal, but and be ready to get rejections. You're going to get rejected on things. I got rejected from MAD for years and years and years. And
yeah, both of us did.
You always have to have a couple irons in the fire. But to be specific, if you want to get a children's book, what I've been told is that you have an outline, especially if you're writing it and illustrating it, have the outline done, have the first 2 or 3 pages fleshed out, have a couple sketches for the interiors, and maybe have 1 or 2 interiors done. The point is you don't want your agent nor your publisher to be surprised by what you give them. So if you have a book idea that's just brilliant that they can't turn down, show them exactly what they're going to get. I wouldn't finish it right away. Don't finish it until you get the approval. But you want to have at least a page. I don't know what the real guide. I don't think there are really real guidelines, but you want to have some of it done so you can say, here's, I want to expand on this. Can you sell it? And the agent then they go around to all the publishers and go that way. But the agent has to agree to take it on. Yeah, it's not easy. I've had a couple agents for different field. I have a couple advertising agents and a literary agent. And the rule of thumb that I've always heard is that you don't really get an agent until you don't need one. And that's kind of cool.
That's funny.
If you're new and up and coming, people don't want to take a chance on you. It's not about your art. It's about the, are you going to do a good job? Is this client going to come back? Are you going to fall off the face of the earth for a couple of days? That kind of thing. When you yourself, you could become, I guess, known. And the agents will come knocking. Hey, we'll get you more work. You just give us 25% of whatever you do, and you have to sit. That's a tough call. I don't think, if you're looking to get into children's books, which, by the way, I do have a whole thing here about books. If you're looking to get into that, think about doing the work first. Think about the business side of it second. I say get your packet together, get everything done, and don't burn too many brain cells thinking about getting an agent.
Can I just ask you, when you say get your packet together, can you let people know what that means?
By a packet, I would say, like if it's for publishing, I would say, have your book planned out. Like I said, have the outline, have a couple pages fleshed out, 1, 2, or 3 of the interior pages or spreads done, maybe even a sketch of the cover. That's what I mean by a packet. And that goes back to the old days when you literally put things in a portfolio and ship them off in a packet.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Probably all done digital now. But don't spend too much time thinking about agents. Get the work done first, and then in the afternoon do a Google for agents in your area, wherever.
And we have another question here for both of you guys. How has being members of the National Cartoonists Society benefited your career?
It ruined my life. I met Ed Steckley.
That checks out. Actually, I'll take this one. Chatfield.
Well, I can speak from experience, as Ed can. Ed is the first vice president of the National Cartoonists Society, and I'm the president. I would consider it probably the most valuable, I want to say decision, the best value decision I think I've ever made in my life. I personally just love cartoonists. I love the way they think. I love the way they look at the world. They're very, very special people. And I was a member and the president of the Australian Cartoonists Association back in Australia for the same reasons, that we all help each other. We all sort of are able to give each other advice and help each other up and give each other a hand with technique and with information about what's happening in the industry now, and about advice on your artwork. It's a very generous group of people, and not just the not just the people who have who seemingly have a lot of time on their hands, who are sort of retired cartoonists. I'm talking about full-time working cartoonists. The Sergio Aragones and Patrick McDonalds of the world, the Kathy Guyswhites and Hilary Prices of the world. They have wonderful and invaluable advice and encouragement to young up-and-coming cartoonists, as well as established cartoonists who have been working for decades, who are still learning things about the industry in which we work. I think the NCS also it's a great sort of historic gauge on how, particularly in America, but also around the world, how the industry has evolved over time. It began in 1946, which is a long time ago. It's one of those things that we all just, it happened very organically. There were a bunch of cartoonists. Ed's children's book namesake, Rube Goldberg, was the inaugural president. And it was one of those sort of just things where they were drawing for the troops, and it was a great way to hang out and and communicate and do something really interesting together and fun. And then they started giving out awards to each other and getting together and every year. And it was just something that made sense because cartooning is a very solitary job. You know, as much as back in the day, maybe you all worked in an artist bullpen in a studio. These days, we all work from our studios at home. And it's great to be able to actually go out to an event like, say, the Reuben Awards weekend, which is usually a weekend where we all go to a different city and give out the awards and do a conference and talk about the industry. And we do drawing for the kids at the local kids hospital and all sorts of events, exhibitions and public talks. And I would say it's one of the most enriching things if you want a career in cartooning and illustration or animation or web comics or panels or children's book illustration or advertising illustration. There are so many different disciplines that it covers, and cartoonists all seem to gravitate toward one another. So I consider it to be the most valuable decision I ever made to become a member. And it's one of the most satisfying things that I do is helping fellow cartoonists through and Ed as well. We're both on the board of the National Cartoonists Society. Ed is actually the Manhattan chapter chair as well as being the vice president. So I'll let him speak to that at a local level.
Well, I will, but I'll add a little bit. If I were to sit and go back and trace every major milestone that I've had in my career, both MAD, books, advertising, everything can be traced back to, I don't know, I want to word this right because it can sound a little bit too grandiose, but meeting the right people at organizations. I used to be a member, well, I am, but I used to be on the board of the National Caricatures Network, which is now called the International Society of Caricature Artists. And I met people there that further down the road introduced me to other people, got me other job. That's where I met Sam Viviano, the art director at MAD at the time. It was through an organization much like the NCS. And the reason I got the children's book deals that I have now is because of people I met at conventions. No one's going to walk up to you at any kind of event or function and say, I need you to do this, but you meet people, people talk, and people introduce you to people. That's been invaluable. If you are an artist and you just sit alone by yourself and don't talk to anybody and, you know, don't get your work out there, you're going to have a hard time at it. Would you agree with that, Jason?
I think so. I think there's a healthy balance between the time that you spend honing your art and sitting and drawing and learning more about your industry and who's working in it, what fields they're actually working in. I think I have received more referrals of work from fellow cartoonists than I ever have from any agent or manager that I've ever had. And that, I think, is true of every cartoonist I've ever spoken to. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Yeah, I have nothing more to add to that. I think you look at it.
Speaking of cartooning, how would you guys like to draw a little bit?
Oh, yeah. All right. So I hope you've been enjoying some of my doodles that I've been doing. But Ed and I both came up through sort of doing caricatures, live caricatures, as well as traditional commissioned caricatures and caricatures for publications. I'm going to let Ed lead off on this because he is, again, Ed, block your ears, mute my microphone for a second. Ed is probably the best live caricaturist that I've ever met. It's a skill that takes many, many, many years to hone because eventually it becomes almost not quite muscle memory, but an intuition. So I'm happy to defer to Ed to kick this off, and we can both work simultaneously and sort of share our insights on caricature.
I think if we're going to talk about caricature, we should get a subject to draw. And yes, I do have my smart guy glasses on. We need, if someone can throw off a name or two of a celebrity that we can Google and get a reference for, go ahead and do it in the chat right now. This will be interesting. Emma Stone.
Oh yeah, Emma Stone. Alejandro has recommended Emma Stone. Oh, Paul McCartney's birthday today as well.
That's a good one. Yeah, Paul McCartney. Nice. How
How
about Paul McCartney with Emma Stone?
Look up Emma.
Oh boy.
I'm gonna look at Emma now.
Yeah.
I reference or two here, Chatfield, and I will paste it to the board so we can both draw this. Or no, I'm not sure how that'll work.
Well, I mean, how do you go about finding reference for a celebrity caricature for something like Mad Magazine?
That's a good idea. You know what? I'm going to start over here, and I'll share my screen.
You know, it's funny. We had some other suggestions from Michael and Catherine. We had LeBron James, Heath Ledger, dearly departed, celebrated people. Oh, look, we have Katie's from Liverpool, so she's a Liverpudlian. She'd like to see Paul McCartney. All right, we're going to do Paul McCartney. How about that?
I'll look up. Look up a reference here of Paul. I'm just in Google. I'm Googling images. Caricatures in MAD. This is generally how it works. Back in the old days, they used to send you a packet. Movie studios and TV studios, they really wanted to have their shows portrayed in MAD magazine, so they would send promotional packets out to MAD before my time. But now, if we have to draw anybody, we just Google it, and great, because you can find, you can generally find any kind of angle you're looking for. With Paul, there's a lot of different ages here. Let me find one that I think is indicative.
I'll tell you what, can you share your screen of Google Images to try and figure out, so we can see which images you think are most appropriate for a reference, and I can do a screen grab and work from there.
Here, I'm sharing.
Because there's so many different versions of him. He looks so different over the years.
Yeah. Now, I'm not the biggest Beatles guy, so I can't. But the thing about Paul is I've also seen a million caricatures of him, so it's going to be hard to get
exactly.
my head. There's something you always have to fight.
Do we have any caricaturists watching in the chat? Just mention in the chat if you're a caricaturist or you've done caricature work.
Also, if I'm drawing anybody for anything, I always have more than a photo of them available.
Right.
I get them from different angles. Ideally, studio shots aren't as good as regular, candid shots. This one.
And
here,
why is that?
Because you want them. They look more natural in a shot that's not staged. This one I've got on the screen.
Right.
That could be anybody.
Mm-hmm.
Sam Viviano is asking if he qualifies.
One of the great caricaturists.
Thanks,
Viviano,
Sam.
and that's why.
Yeah, he's new to the club, but he qualifies.
Also Michael Young, Nick Galifianakis, Alejandro Euros. It's funny because there are so many people who, and I'm sure some of the viewers already know it, but Tom Richmond, who we mentioned earlier, has been doing a daily Caricature sort of group on Facebook, which is where he'll post a caricature subject, a celebrity, and then everyone has to draw a caricature of that. What's interesting is that everyone's comes out so vastly different because caricature is such a unique thing. It's how you see the subject. It's not just, there's no one way to draw that person. Which is why in this, what we're about to show you now, I will draw a version of Paul McCartney and Ed will draw a version of Paul McCartney. And you can sort of see how what the difference is here. Emma Stone, yeah, Alejandro mentioned that Tom Richmond's Caricature subject for today was Emma Stone. However, Tom has already posted the caricature, and I'm very reluctant to try and compete with that. So I'm happy to do something a bit different.
Yeah, if you don't know what Caricature is, it's something that he started up a few months ago now as a something to pass the time away during all this. I was really active in it in the very beginning. Then I got kind of busy and a little bit lazy, and I stopped playing along. But I highly recommend it. All right, how do I wonder if I can resize an image here. So
you brought that into Aggie.io.
Yeah, I want to know,
which is an online drawing program.
is there a
It's
transform?
like an online Photoshop in a browser.
Is there a transform tool in this? Anybody know?
I'm not entirely sure. I'm pretty new to the software, but this this kind of I suppose it's usually back in the day, you know, you would have lots of printed out photographs and references or a file. For instance, Sam Viviano in the chat, he would have a huge reference library of images in you know, like filing cabinets full of these things. And now we have the luxury of Google Images to sort of put on the page, but we still are doing the same job of sort of trying to distill their look, to try and make it a bit more, to whittle it down to their essential features, because that's what caricature is effectively asymmetry, drawing attention to certain features whilst retaining the likeness, which is why it's always that delicate balancing act. You worked at theme parks. That was your pedigree coming up. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Theme parks for years. That was how I first got my first job drawing.
Right.
I was in college. I answered an ad to come draw caricatures at the theme park, which was, the theme park was in Minnesota, and I was going to school in Wisconsin. And I went, wow, that's kind of a dream come true, because I used to watch the theme park caricature artists when I was a kid. There's a theme park that we would go to. And I went, well, that's absolutely perfect for me. So I answered the ad, and I went and worked for a young fellow named Tom Richmond, and kept doing that for almost 20 years. And that's how I supported my illustration career. I would sit in a chair, draw people for 12 hours a day, and you know, when you draw thousands of people a year, you get you know, you have pretty good at it. And let's see, all right. So in the end, I was training people and doing all that. So you drawing one, I'm drawing one too. So no copying.
I'm fascinated by where you start, because I know that some caricaturists insist on face shape is a very big and important aspect of caricature. And is that something you start with, the face shape first?
I'll tell you this for sure. Every face I tackle differently. It depends on my mood. I'm looking at Paul's. I'm looking at Paul's face shape here, and it just kind of came out and grabbed me a bit. So I'm going to start there, and I'm just going to do this quick blue line sketch. When I was drawing live in the theme park, there's none of this allowed. If our caricaturists who worked with saw me do this, they'd probably throw a shoe at me, because I used to train them how to do this. I would say, no sketching, you know, and I'd grab their erasers and throw it, you know, and yeah. But now that I do this digitally, I do a lot more of this stuff, where I just I go where the wind blows in a drawing. Good thing about all the experience that I've got is I know, you know, generally I know how to construct a face. So I know what's happening inside here, for example. I'm not just going on visual cues. I'm trying to pay attention to what's going on underneath.
Yeah, right. I like the eyelids. I like how they're sort of asymmetrical.
Yeah, I'm going to shoot for, I don't think, I see his face as doing this, where it's got kind of this curve to it.
Okay.
And that's not right or wrong, but it's kind of where the wind is blowing me here. And it's just, mouth's a little off center. I'm just going to scribble it in here and really focus on the things that have to do with his expression, because I know he's got heavy eyelids.
Totally.
But I want to capture this expression that he's got. He's got kind of, in this top picture here, he's got kind of a smart alecky smile. And his mouth goes down on one side, goes up on this side. And there's no rhyme or reason to it. I'm just kind of going with my gut. And that's the good thing about drawing digitally here, because if I don't like it, I can just take the lasso tool and delete everything, start over.
But to my point earlier, you're going with your gut, which has been sort of honed over many years of intuition and experience.
Right. Yeah.
You've
That's
drawn so many faces.
Yeah, but you also want to, you have to trust yourself as an artist. You have to, even if you're new and you're not that experienced, you have to take risks and, see what works and experiment.
Yeah,
Sam could.
that's good advice.
I'm just gonna. Now I have a quick.
I'm sort of going off the bottom pouty little reference that you have there. Because he's got a little bit of a mullet coming out there from behind the ears.
I've drawn a mullet. It's really cool software. It's called Aggie, if people don't see it in the chat.
Yeah, Pete, I think Wacom just posted the link in the chat.
This is great. Little plug for Aggie here. It's very.
Yep, there it is.
In Photoshop, normally I'd have my brush, my opacity down to 80% and the hardness down to about 80 or so. So I'm gonna do that now. Yeah, that's it. I'm just gonna delete lines, I think, because I want to get it consistent. And
so the rough that you just did, that sort of, I guess it's just pencils, it's sketches that you were mentioning was not okay in theme parks because you've just got to draw. It's the Wild West out there. You just got to draw by the seat of your pants.
You're really good at drawing again without dipping your toe in the water. But what I'm doing when I do the final art, I'm not using this sketch as the gospel. What I'm doing now is every line I draw, I'm going to try to look at the sketch that's underneath and go with my gut and say that line, I'm going to correct that line a bit. So I'm already drawing his eyes a little lower.
Yeah, right.
Sketch here. So
you're second guessing your own.
I wouldn't say that.
Intuitions.
I'm just refining a bit.
I'm
going to eyebrow up a bit.
Have you seen? There's a big trend right now of doing caricatures in one line, trying to do a line drawing without taking a pen off the page. Have you given that a try?
I'm too busy working. What that is? It's like a thing people are doing.
Yeah, it's becoming very popular.
Explain
It's
it.
a stylistic thing, I think. What are your thoughts on, as far as caricature goes, what are your thoughts on if someone wants to get into it as a career versus having it as something on the side while you're developing your illustration career or developing your career as a comic strip cartoonist or an editorial cartoonist or something similar?
The days of making a
way
living,
to make some cash?
yeah, the days of making a living as a caricaturist, I think, are a bit more limited now because the theme park model has kind of gone the way of the dodo. I know a lot of people that make their living drawing at parties and all that. That is that you're generally by yourself. When we worked in the theme park, we had a group of artists around us. There were some who were more seasoned. There were some who had been there longer, and we all generally learned from each other, and that was the best thing about it. You could watch
okay.
There was someone who was doing a good drawing. It could get kind of raucous, and you get out of your chair if you weren't drawing. You can go watch and go, wow, how'd they do that? I've worked with some of the best caricature artists I think that have ever worked live.
Who would you recommend people check out?
Well, Tom Richmond, obviously. It was a big, one of the guys I learned a lot from was a guy named Gary Fozen, who's now dead, so you can't go see him anymore. I used to work with an artist named Kevin Berg, who's on Facebook. He's just fantastic. Took everything that was taught, but put their own spin on it. That's what you want.
Right.
Caricature artist is learning from someone else. You don't want to ape the person who's instructing you. You want to take what they're giving you and put your spin on it. That's the hardest part to overcome. Young artists oftentimes ape other people. We've all, looked at Mort Drucker and Mad and, tried to do that.
Yeah.
But you're like a lot happier, a lot more gratifying when you do work that's all your own, but is inspired by other people, in my opinion.
Right. Yeah, I agree. The work that I have up on the walls, I would never try and mimic it perfectly, but there's a lot that I take from it, as far as a lesson in anything from composition to line work to color work to spontaneity. And I love the work of Al Hirschfeld, as you do, I know. There's certain artists that when you look at them, you look at their work and you can see the process behind the creativity. You can just you can glean a lot from just watching them, looking at their collection of work, and then seeing also how it develops over the years. I see a lot of value in, getting back to some of the questions you were getting before. I see a lot of value in trying to study the work of your predecessors.
Yeah. I also think, you can tell a lot by the artist, by the art that they do. I've talked about this a lot, and I still really can't pin it down to a few words, but you can tell by looking at an artist's work, and I think that maybe it's more so in caricature, or maybe that's just because that's what I pay attention to, but you can tell if someone isn't very fond of their subject, or if someone doesn't feel like drawing that day, or if someone's not in a
Even
good mood.
subconsciously.
I think it definitely shows in their drawing. And when you look at some of the greats, like Al Hirschfeld, or who else am I thinking of, Jason? Like Sebastian Kruger.
You're thinking of Sebastian Kruger, Sam Viviano, Mort Drucker. You're thinking about Angelo Torres.
What you're doing in a caricature is you're making a statement about that person, an editorial statement, whether you want to or not.
Right.
And I like to think I can look at, people's caricatures of celebrities and get a feel for if that person, is this person a fan of Indiana Jones, or is this person not too into, you can kind of see what's going on in their head, I always think, by caricatures. I still don't know how to articulate that, so maybe I'll try it again some other day. But yeah,
Well, it's like peering into the cartoonist's subconscious.
Yeah, a caricature is a very personal thing. I mean, you're making a statement, and it's your stamp on it.
Right.
Let's see, where am I going with Paul here? Are we losing our audience? I really like Paul's.
No, we're good.
No, you've only lost a few people, and they had to go. They had something else to do. It wasn't that they weren't liking your work.
Oh, I'm sure.
Their excuse was they had to do anything else.
We had a question about what you're working on right now. It's called Aggie. It's a online program that kind of mimics Photoshop, right, guys?
Pretty good job.
I would say, yeah.
I'm
still quite new to it.
Today, and it's pretty cool. And
it's built using if you just go to aggie.io, it's a program that was built using TypeScript, which is a superset of JavaScript. It's an interesting way to create a drawing program, and it works really well. It has all the same properties and shortcuts, keyboard shortcuts as Photoshop, but you can both work on the same screen, on the same sort of artboard, which means if you're collaborating on something or you're workshopping something,
we're miles apart.
What was that?
Jason and I are on the same file here, but we're miles apart. This is
Yes, they're both based in New York, but we won't give you their addresses.
Oh, sure.
I'll give you Ed's if you want it. I mean, just.
And down by
the van down by the river, by the Chili's and the Flingers. There is I've kind of gone right off the rails with this one, by the way, with this. I've taken it in a totally different direction. But what I think is interesting about things like Tom's Caricature and things like that is looking at everyone's different take on the same face and what they've decided to pull out as the feature that they are going to exaggerate. And then also seeing that even people who have chosen the same thing to exaggerate, be it the nose, the mouth, the ears, the eyelids, whatever it is, they've exaggerated it to a different extent. So it's not even the same, even if they did choose the same thing to exaggerate, it's a different result, I should say.
I'm going to do some editing of my drawing here. This is why I like.
I'm using.
Hey, while we're coming up on the 2 hour mark, talk a little bit about how, Jason, since you are president of the National Cartoonists Society, talk a little bit about how people can get involved and sign up, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. You can go to nationalcartoonists.com. There's a button there that says how to join. We take cartoonists to be a member, you need to be approved by the membership committee, which just checks that you're a cartoonist, working as a cartoonist. We also have a special membership category for people who are 27 and under, called the 27 Club. So if you are a young cartoonist working, you can join for $27. It's a special deal for young cartoonists that we have, if we have any young cartoonists watching. The National Cartoonist Society does have a lot of local chapters as well. So, for instance, Ed and I are members of the Manhattan chapter. Nearby is the Long Island chapter, as well as the Connecticut chapter, the New Jersey chapter.
What about people living in Canada?
There's 17 chapters.
We actually, you know what?
Right?
We have international chapters, and I think, Nancy Beeman from, is it Beeman or Byman? Disney animator and cartoonist and great storyboard artist, is I think the unofficial hornblower of the NCS in Canada. She's a fantastic, a staunch advocate of the NCS and a great member. She is a very talented cartoonist.
We have another question here. If you're under the 27 age mark, how does one go about applying?
That's all you.
You would go, so you would go to nationalcartoonists.com, and there's a button there that says how to join, and it tells you what you need to do, what you need to provide in order to apply for membership to the NCS. And once we receive that and all that information, the membership secretary goes through it, and if it's all in order, takes it to the membership committee just to ratify it all and just check that it all checks out. The other thing that you can do is also, if you have a local chapter, for instance, if you're around the Great Lakes, say you're in Michigan or in Wisconsin or something, you just check the page there, because you can see if there are any local events happening with the different chapters of the National Cartoonist Society online or in person. At the moment, there's some online Zoom meetings that local chapters are doing. And it's a good way to actually get to know a little bit more about the NCS before you join up. If you're sort of uncertain about what it is or whether it's worthwhile, it's definitely worth visiting one of those local chapter events. I would certainly recommend reaching out to your local NCS chapter chair, which they're all listed on the website there, just to sort of see if it's something that you would be interested in. I highly recommend it, obviously, for any young artist trying to sort of make their way in the industry as an illustrator or a cartoonist or a comic strip cartoonist or a webcomic cartoonist or any number of different disciplines. A lot of our members actually straddle several different disciplines of cartooning, which is just the nature of being a cartoonist these days. Now
it's everything from animators, illustrators, everything. And even
it's an interesting mix of people now.
Present company excluded.
Oh no, you guys are definitely interesting. Yes.
Doug, you've been to several of our National Cartoonist Society Reuben Award weekends. What are some of the things that you enjoy most about those? I'm turning it on you now.
Definitely. Well, yeah, Wacom has participated in quite a few now, and we just love mingling with all the cartoonists. And you guys are so creative and humorous. It's like one big happy time the entire time. It's great.
I agree. I second that.
You guys also like to eat and drink, which is also helpful.
We do a lot of that.
Yes, definitely. There's a lot of eating and drinking at the events. As I say, you know, we're all sort of cooped up in our studios most of the year, so it's a nice opportunity to actually get out and, first of all, wear pants, but second of all, actually, you know, talk to each other about what we're doing, and we have conferences about, you know, presentations about what we're working on, be it transitioning from comic strips to graphic novels and novelizations and book publishing, or transitioning online, finding a new audience online. We have a lot of great webcomic cartoonists who do some fantastic work, who are members of the NCS, people like Gemma Carell, Luke McGarry, Nick Selleck, who does Awkward Yeti. A lot of great webcomic cartoonists who are finding success outside of the traditional mediums of print, I should say media, of print and sort of, you know, books and publishing and newspapers and magazines and all that sort of thing. It's actually a really exciting time to be in the industry, because everything is transitioning very quickly to a lot of new and exciting ways of making a living as a cartoonist. I'm learning as much from from all these sessions as any of the attendees, because as I say, we only get to hang out once a year, all together as one sort of national get together, and then in the interim, for instance, the Manhattan chapter of the NCS get together about once a month or so. We used to. We still get together on video chat now once a month. But we all sort of like to keep in touch with each other. We're all very supportive. If someone has some work that they sort of maybe, you know, they're like, oh, you know, who would be great for this? I'll refer it to this person. You know, oh, I know they're doing stuff like that at the moment. Or, oh, you need another caricaturist for a 3 caricaturist. Yeah, great. I know just the people. You know, there's a lot of referral. It's a good referral network professionally. It's a good network of people who, if someone says, it gets a client saying, hey, listen, I need you to jump on Zoom and live draw a conference for us, or do live caricatures virtually or digitally. The first phone call is to another NCS member to go, hey, how are you doing this? You know, tell me what program are you using, what streaming, you know, what software are you using, you know, using a Wacom tablet, are you streaming on Zoom? What are you doing? It's an invaluable and limitless, really, resource of information, and a very friendly and supportive community of artists who go all the way back, you know, 70 odd years to the 40s across several generations. So I would highly recommend it.
I second all that.
Yeah, that seems like a good point to kind of wrap this up, guys. Thanks a lot for joining us. We really appreciate it. We had quite a few people stay on, and that's a good thing to see. Nick Galifianakis said, finally. Thanks, Nick, for that. But no, we really appreciate you guys coming on and talking to the folks about your work and how you work. And this has been great. So thanks a lot. And we hope to see you soon once we're able to travel again.
Yeah, we're looking forward.
Absolutely.
Thanks, everybody. This is great. Was there any last minute questions or anything that we should worry about? Or are we on?
There's some things coming through on chat here. Everybody's just thanking you. No real questions.
You're welcome. Thank you for having us. I hope it was helpful. You've got all our details, Ed Steckley and Jason Chatfield, and social media.
Someone did ask if they can share their portfolios with you.
Look at the top.
Yeah.
course.
Of course.
You can send it to either secretary@nationalcartoonists.com or president@nationalcartoonists.com.
I'm VP.
Oh, you are. You are VP. VP. at nationalcartoonists.com. That's right.
All right. Thanks a lot, guys. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Dougie.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
See ya. All right. Thanks. Great job. Bye.